Here is the reality Donald Trump did not see coming. The United States no longer controls Canada's grain exports. Not partially, not temporarily, structurally. For years, Washington operated on a simple assumption. If Canada wanted to sell grain at scale, it had to pass through American ports, American inspection regimes, and American logistics choke points. That assumption gave the U.S. leverage: economic, political, and strategic. Tariffs could be threatened, delays could be imposed, rules could be reinterpreted. And then, almost quietly, that leverage disappeared. While Donald Trump was focused on tariffs, retaliation, and coercive trade rhetoric, something far more dangerous to U.S. power was taking shape beneath the surface, a physical trade corridor that no policy tweet could touch. Canadian grain began flowing south, not to U.S. Ports, not onto U.S. Ships, not into U.S. Inspection bottlenecks, but directly to Mexico. No American unloading. No American certification delays. No exposure to arbitrary tariffs. Just uninterrupted movement from Canadian farms to Mexican consumers. This is not a loophole. This is not a workaround. This is not a temporary diversion. It is a permanent change in the geography of power. And the most unsettling part for Washington? There is nothing the White House can do to reverse it. No executive order can tear up steel already laid. No tariff can stop a train that never enters the American export system. To understand how this happened, you have to understand the illusion that made U.S. policymakers complacent in the first place. For decades, U.S. trade leverage rested on one deeply ingrained belief: American infrastructure was indispensable. Canadian grain had to move through U.S. ports: Seattle, Portland, New Orleans, Houston. American inspectors certified quality. American terminals handled loading. American logistics firms captured fees, jobs, and political influence. Canada produced the grain, but the United States controlled the gate. That system worked until unpredictability poisoned it. Under Trump, tariffs were announced, withdrawn, re-announced, and escalated without warning. Border enforcement became inconsistent. Inspection regimes turned opaque. Delays became arbitrary. Exporters could no longer plan months ahead in an environment where rules changed week to week. For farmers and grain shippers, that chaos was not ideological, it was financial. Missed delivery windows meant canceled contracts. Delayed inspections meant spoiled cargo. Port congestion meant weeks of lost revenue. Reliability collapsed, and reputation followed. Here is where Washington made its critical mistake. It assumed that dissatisfaction would lead to negotiation. Instead, it led to exit. Because leverage only works when there is no alternative. The moment an alternative becomes physically viable, legally protected, and economically competitive, control evaporates. The United States believed it controlled policy. What it actually controlled was routing, and routing can be redesigned. Once Canadian exporters realized they could move grain without touching U.S., ports without entering U.S., inspection systems without exposure to U.S., political volatility, the question was no longer whether they would leave the American route. The question became, how fast? In the next section, we examine the infrastructure that made that exit possible and why it represents something far more permanent than a trade dispute. The alternative Washington failed to anticipate already existed quietly, methodically, and legally under the name Canadian Pacific Kansas City. CPKC is not just another railroad. It is the only single-line rail network in North America that directly connects Canada, the United States, and Mexico without requiring handoffs between different rail operators. One railroad, one operating system, one bill of lading. That distinction is everything. Most rail networks break at borders. Every break introduces delay, cost, vulnerability, and critically external control. Inspections, scheduling conflicts, labor rules, and political interference accumulate at each interchange. CPKC removes those friction points entirely. Grain loaded in Saskatchewan does not pause to be reclassified. Wheat from Manitoba does not sit idle waiting for a second railroad to take over. A unit train can move seamlessly from Canadian farmland to Mexican industrial centers without ever leaving the CPKC system. This is not convenience. This is structural independence. The network spans roughly 32,000 kilometers of track, linking every major Canadian production region directly to Mexico's largest consumption centers: Monterrey, Guadalajara, Mexico City, without requiring U.S. ports, U.S. terminals, or U.S. Export services. The trains still pass through American territory, but they do not serve American markets. They do not unload. They do not interact with U.S. export infrastructure. The United States is reduced to a transit corridor, much like airspace crossed without landing. That distinction is what transforms a trade dispute into a loss of leverage. And this network did not materialize by accident. It was built deliberately, at enormous cost, in anticipation of precisely the kind of instability Trump would later create. The turning point came on the 14th of April 2023, in Kansas City, Missouri. With a ceremonial final spike, Canadian Pacific and Kansas City Southern officially completed their merger, creating CPKC, the first true transnational railroad in North America. The price, $31 billion. The path, years of regulatory battles, political scrutiny, and intense opposition. Notably, Canadian National Railway submitted a higher competing bid, $33.7 billion, and still lost. Why? Because regulators were not approving a price, they were approving a vision. At the center of that vision was Keith Creel, who understood something most policymakers missed. Trade volatility was not temporary noise. It was a permanent feature of the new geopolitical environment. And volatility creates demand for alternatives. Creel recognized that, as U.S. trade policy became more unpredictable, exporters would not wait for stability to return. They would reroute. But rerouting at continental scale requires infrastructure measured in decades, not election cycles. The merger created exactly that infrastructure. Suddenly, Canada had a direct, protected, legally compliant corridor to Mexico. Suddenly, Mexico had access to premium Canadian grain without exposure to U.S. political risk. And suddenly, American ports once assumed indispensable became optional. This was not a reaction to Trump. It was an anticipation of him. By the time tariffs were threatened and inspections politicized, the steel was already laid. The system was already live. The alternative was already operational. In the next section, we examine why this wasn't just strategic foresight, but an irreversible physical commitment that locked in a new North American trade reality. What makes this shift irreversible is not rhetoric, it is hardware. For the 2025-2026 crop years, Canadian Pacific Kansas City committed more than 500 million Canadian dollars specifically to grain transportation capacity. This was not a symbolic investment. It was a physical lock-in of a new trade reality. CPKC completed the purchase of 5,900 new high-capacity covered hopper cars, purpose-built for bulk grain. These are not standard rail cars. They carry more volume per unit, load and unload faster, protect grain quality better, and reduce maintenance downtime. Each one represents decades of service life. Alongside them came 100 new Tier 4 diesel-electric locomotives, the most advanced class allowed under current environmental standards. More power, higher efficiency, longer trains, lower emissions, the ability to move more grain with fewer interruptions across thousands of kilometers. This is not flexibility, this is commitment. Rail assets are long-lived by design. Hopper cars routinely operate for 30 to 40 years. Locomotives follow similar timelines. When a railroad buys equipment at this scale, it is not hedging, it is declaring intent. CPKC is not preparing for a temporary spike in Mexican demand. It is building capacity for a generation of Canada-Mexico trade. The numbers reflect that reality. 27 million metric tons of Canadian grain moved in the 2024-2025 crop year, with weekly capacity rising towards 685,000 metric tons at peak operation. Once you invest at this scale, you are no longer reacting to policy. You are outlasting it. And that infrastructure only matters if it delivers. Which brings us to the journey that made Washington's loss of leverage undeniable. The most powerful argument against U.S. leverage did not come from a press release. It arrived on steel wheels. A unit train loaded with Canada Western Red Spring wheat departed Manitoba and traveled more than 3,200 kilometers to Mexico City entirely on the CPKC network. It crossed multiple U.S. states, yet never entered the American export system. No ports, no terminals, no inspections, no political exposure. At the destination, Mark Carney stood alongside Keith Creel at a grain terminal, watching Canadian wheat arrive directly at Mexican bakeries. The symbolism was deliberate and unmistakable. Canadian grain, Canadian rail cars, Canadian railroad, Mexican consumers. The United States was physically present on the map and economically absent from the transaction. Carney broke bread made from locally milled flour and made the point explicit. This was a direct farm-to-table connection between Canadian farmers and Mexican households, without American intermediaries capturing value at any stage. This moment mattered because it transformed abstraction into fact. The route was no longer hypothetical. It was operational, repeatable, scalable. For exporters, that changes behavior permanently. Reliability replaces uncertainty. Predictable transit replaces political risk. Contracts are signed with confidence instead of contingency clauses. From that point forward, Canada-Mexico grain trade was no longer an alternative route. It became the safer one. And once safety and predictability shift, trade flows follow often without ever coming back. Once the Canada-Mexico corridor became operational, the consequences were immediate and asymmetrical. The United States did not lose Canadian grain production. It lost control over the pathway. And that distinction is fatal to leverage. American ports lost throughput. Pacific Northwest terminals that once handled Canadian grain bound for Latin America saw volumes decline. Gulf Coast hubs, Houston, New Orleans, Mobile lost traffic that had generated port fees, inspection revenue, shipping contracts, and thousands of logistics jobs. Entire value chains quietly evaporated. Canada, by contrast, gained something far more valuable than short-term export growth: strategic autonomy. Grain producers gained reliable access to a large, growing market without exposure to USS. Political volatility. Value previously captured by American intermediaries remained within Canadian supply chains: rail, rolling stock manufacturing, logistics, and financing. Mexico emerged as the silent winner. With a population of roughly 130 million and an expanding middle class, it needs stable grain imports. Canadian wheat, especially Canada Western Red Spring, offers high protein content and consistent quality. More importantly, it now arrives through a supply chain insulated from U.S. policy shocks. This is not a zero-sum trade skirmish. It is a reallocation of structural advantage. Trade flows follow reliability. Capital follows predictability. Once those attributes shift, the system does not revert out of nostalgia or diplomacy. It locks in. And that is why this corridor represents not a tactical adjustment, but a durable reordering of North American trade. There is a reason this shift alarms U.S. strategists. There is no policy lever left to pull. Tariffs cannot be imposed on goods in transit under the USMCA framework. Rail movements between Canada and Mexico through U.S. territory are explicitly protected. Blocking them would constitute a treaty violation, with immediate retaliation risks. Ports cannot be pressured because ports are no longer used. Inspection regimes cannot be weaponized because inspections are no longer required. Shipping companies cannot be coerced because ships are no longer involved. This is the core miscalculation. The United States built its trade leverage around institutions, ports, inspections, regulatory choke points. Canada responded not with counter policy, but with counter geometry. Rail infrastructure does not negotiate. Steel does not wait for elections. Once tracks exist and rolling stock is deployed, political discretion collapses into operational reality. Even if Washington attempted indirect pressure delays, labor disputes, administrative obstacles, the cost would fall disproportionately on U.S. workers and states hosting transit segments. The economic self-harm would outweigh any marginal leverage gained. In short, the United States cannot undo this without breaking its own trade agreements or sabotaging its own territory. And no serious government does either. At the beginning of this story, Donald Trump believed power came from threats, tariffs announced at podiums, pressure applied through headlines, dominance asserted through rhetoric. What this episode reveals is something far more enduring. Real power lives in pathways. It lives in the routes goods must take, the infrastructure that cannot be rerouted overnight, and the systems that operate independently of political mood swings. Canada did not defeat the United States in a negotiation. It made negotiation irrelevant. By investing in irreversible infrastructure, Canada removed itself from dependency. By creating a direct connection to Mexico, it replaced vulnerability with choice. By doing so quietly and legally, it avoided confrontation while achieving autonomy. The irony is unavoidable. Every threat accelerated this outcome. Every tariff announcement pushed exporters to seek stability elsewhere. Every act of unpredictability validated the logic of bypass. The result is now permanent. Trains will continue to run, wheat will continue to flow, Mexican consumers will continue to buy Canadian grain, and American leverage, once assumed automatic, will remain absent. This is not about Trump as an individual. It is about a lesson states relearn again and again. You can intimidate markets for a moment. You cannot intimidate infrastructure. And once the road exists, power follows it, whether Washington approves or not.